We'll start with this quotation by Niels Bohr. Bohr said that if anybody says he can think about quantum physics without getting giddy, that only shows he has not understood the first thing about them. So he has given me a broad canvas. Even if I have not understood, that's not my word. The word he used in German for dizzy or giddy was schwindelig. The outline of the talk, we start with an introduction to quantum computing, then we come down to the core of quantum computing, which is qubits and quantum gates, then some very interesting algorithms, Shor's and Brouwer's algorithms, physical realization of quantum computers and simulators, future applications of quantum computing, unicast and multicast scenarios, followed by nanotechnology and nanocomputing. Why quantum computing? The answer lies here. William Shockley invented the transistor at Bell Labs, for which he won the Nobel Prize. It can be seen here. After that, Moore's law came, and for the last 25 years almost, it has been obeyed very strictly. It says that the number of transistors on an IC doubles every 18 months. And you can see that's really happened. From 1970 till almost the present, the number of transistors has been steadily increasing. Another way to look at this plot is this. This shows the number of impurities required in the base of a silicon transistor. So the number of impurities required has been shrinking with the shrinking size of the transistor. So we are almost at the unity stage. So what happens when we hit this? You can't have half an electron in the base. So what do we do once we hit this roadblock? So quantum computing brings together two giants of the 20th century, quantum mechanics and information theory. So quantum mechanics has its own allied fields like Hilbert space, entanglement, measurement, decoherence and so on. And information theory again has its allied fields like computing, Shannon's theorem, complexity, cryptography and so on. So quantum computing is a synthesis of the two, and you can see the relationship is really quite complicated. You have got lots of things involved. At present, what we are doing is we are working with classical information most of the time. So classical information is a subset of quantum information. The information technology we are working on presently is confined to this part. But we are now trying to get into quantum information. So the computing power we will achieve will be much more with this. A few quantum algorithms that start with speed up. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. So unless you get something out of the computing paradigm, that is the ultimate indicator of its success. So in 1985 came Buche's algorithm, which demonstrates that task quantum computers perform in one shot what classical computers do in two shots. This progression has been going on steadily. Buche's Jozsa algorithm came, which demonstrates an exponential separation between classical deterministic and quantum algorithms. Next came Bernstein-Maserani algorithm, which demonstrated super polynomial separation. The Simon's algorithm, exponential separation. After that came two very interesting algorithms which are usually called the killer applications of quantum computing. In fact, somebody has remarked that if 100 years later quantum computers are built, then most probably they will be used to run Brouwer's algorithm. Brouwer's algorithm has been invented in 1996 by Love Brouwer for quantum physics. And Shor's algorithm came in 1994 for factoring. We are all familiar with bits. Bit stands for binary digit in classical computing. In quantum computing, we have got quantum bits or qubits. What is so special about the qubit? A qubit can be in a state other than ket 0 and ket 1. We are borrowing the Dirac notation of quantum mechanics. This is ket 0, this is ket 1. So a qubit can be a superposition of both 0 and 1. For example, this qubit ket psi is alpha ket 0 plus beta ket 1. The sum of the probabilities alpha and beta mod alpha square plus mod beta square has to come out as unity. In matrix form, this qubit would be written as alpha beta. This is the standard notation and we will be using this all through the presentation. Now what is so interesting about qubits? If you have got a classical computer and you have got two registers A and B, A can hold 4 bits, B can hold 4 bits. If you add the two registers, you get your answer, that's alright, but you get just one answer, which is A plus B. The power of quantum computing comes from the fact that if you have got a quantum register, then every qubit can be in a superposition of both 0 and 1. So register A can have 4 qubits. So it can hold a total of 2 to the power 4, which is 16 values together simultaneously. Similarly, register B has again got 16 values together simultaneously. So if you add these two numbers together, you realize all the 256 answers together. So if we add two 4-qubit quantum registers, we add all 16 combinations of register 1 and all 16 combinations of register 2 to get all 256 answers simultaneously. There is nothing in classical computing which can match this. As the number of qubits goes up, this would be even more. 2 to the power 5, 32, and 2 to the power 5, 32. 32 into 32 is even more than this. So we get exponentially fast. If you look at a NOT gate, we are all familiar with a NOT gate. A NOT gate converts a 0 to 1 and 1 to a 0. What does a quantum NOT gate do? Quantum NOT gate works on a qubit. A qubit is of the form alpha ket 0 plus beta ket 1. Now if we have got a quantum NOT gate, it gives the output as alpha ket 1 plus beta ket 0. So it inverts a 0 to a 1 and 1 to 0, and it does that simultaneously for both the states. So the matrix form of this NOT gate would be this. How we achieve this, we'll come to that shortly. Alpha 0 plus beta 1 would be alpha beta. This is the matrix form of the gate. We multiply the two together, we get beta alpha. So this would be alpha 1 plus beta 0. So the matrix representation of the quantum NOT gate is 2 by 2 matrix. And it converts this alpha beta to beta alpha. So it works as a NOT gate simultaneously on both states. Another example is a quantum Z gate. A quantum Z gate leaves 0 unchanged and it changes sign of ket 1 to ket minus 1. So if you give the input as alpha 0 plus beta 1, the 0 remains unchanged and 1 becomes minus 1. So you end up with alpha 0 minus beta 1. The matrix form of this would be this. So if you multiply this matrix with a 0 is 1 0, alpha is 1 and beta is 0. You end up again with a 0. And if you multiply this with a 1, you end up with a minus 1. So that is alpha 0 minus beta 1. A Hadamard gate is also called a square root gate. It converts a 0 to 0 plus 1 upon under root 2 and a 1 to 0 minus 1 upon under root 2. If you look at it carefully, the sum of probabilities again comes out 1. 1 upon under root 2 whole square plus 1 upon under root 2 whole square is unity. So if you give the combination alpha ket 0 plus beta ket 1, that gets converted to alpha 0 plus 1 by under root 2 plus beta ket 0 minus ket 1 upon under root 2. And this is the matrix representation of the Hadamard gate. You can see, if you give the input as 0, you multiply the matrices together and end up with 0 plus 1 by root 2. A 1 would give 0 minus 1 upon under root 2. Alpha 0 plus beta 1 would give alpha 0 plus 1 by root 2 plus beta 0 minus 1 by root 2. If you give the input as 0 plus 1 by root 2, you end up with a 0. If you give the input as 0 minus 1 upon under root 2, you end up with a 1. So we have got other such gates and matrices. Pauli matrices are very useful. When we come down to quantum telecoordination, you will see their use. I am not going into the details, I have just written down the matrix form of the matrices. Next we come down to controlled gates. We are all familiar with transistors. Like the base current controls the collector current, or the gate voltage controls the source drain current, and things like that. So what is a controlled NOT gate? A controlled gate has got two inputs, A and B. Now A is the control qubit, B is the target qubit. If A is 0, nothing happens to B. If A is 1, B gets inverted. So in other words, the output for A is unchanged, it remains A. For B you get B modulo 2 sum A. So if the input state is 0 0, the control qubit is 0, target qubit is 0, you end up again with 0. If the control qubit is 0, target qubit is 1, you again end up with 0. If the control qubit is 1 and target qubit is 0, you end up converting it to 1 1. And if both are 1, you end up with a 1 0. So this is an example of a controlled NOT gate. The CNOT gate matrix is now of 4 by 4 size rather than 2 by 2 because it has got two inputs. So the output matrix Y can be computed by matrix multiplication again. Next we come down to a swap gate. A swap gate is basically three CNOT gates connected like this. It ends up swapping the two qubits. If I got input A here and B here, I end up with B here and A here. You can also represent a swap gate like this. But its structure is made up of 3 gates like this. So this is the matrix of the swap gate. You can see it's working with the input to the gate is A and B. The first CNOT gate gives the output as A and A modulo 2 some P. Now the output of the first stage is input to the second stage. We end up with B, A plus B. This goes to the input as the third stage. This is the third stage is input, and we end up swapping the B and A. So this is the truth table of a swap gate. In all the 4 combinations, we end up swapping A and B. How do we find a matrix representation of quantum gate transistors? The matrix representation is found by computing the outer product. This is called the outer product. So, for example, at NOT gate, the matrix representation would be outer product of input with the output. So, this is the input 0, output is 1, input is 1, output is 0. So, after matrix multiplication, we end up with the matrix representation of a NOT gate. Same thing you can continue for a swap gate. If you give the input as 0, 0, you end up with 0, 0. So, this would be the matrix product of the two. You add all the 4 matrices, this is the matrix for the swap gate. Next we come down to control gates. This is a Toffoli gate or C square NOT gate. Here what happens is you have got 2 control bits, A and B. If both of them are 1, only then C is inverted. Otherwise, nothing changes. So the first 2 bits are control bits which remain unaffected by the action of the Toffoli gate. So you end up with A and B. The third bit is the target bit, which is inverted only if both the control bits are 1. Else it is left unchanged. So it is a double control gate. That's why I have C square now. Now we come down to some very interesting things, that is entanglement. First of all, what is entanglement? To explain that, we start with Bell states or EPR states. EPR stands for Einstein, Podolsky and Rosen, who first talked about these states. Suppose we have got a circuit like this, a Hadamard gate followed by a C0 gate. If we give the input to this as 0, 0, so you end up with 0 plus 1 by root 2 here and a 0 here. After the C0 gate, you end up with 0, 0 plus 1, 1 upon under root 2. So this is the first Bell state, right? If you give the input as 0, 1, you end up with this, and so on. So you have got these 4 entangled states. What is so interesting about them? The fact that there are no single qubit gates A and B, such that ket psi is ket A to ket B. You can't decompose this into ket A to ket B. It is 0, 0 plus 1, 1 upon under root 2. You can't find a factor like 0 plus 1 by root 2 into 0 minus 1 by root 2. So these two always have to stay together. So what makes it interesting is, suppose I measure the first qubit and I end up measuring a 0. I have got equal chance of measuring 0 and 1. Suppose I got a 0 for the first entangled state, then it is certain that the second state I will measure is also 0. Because these two zeros go together, they are entangled. On the other hand, if I end up measuring a 1, it is certain that the second measurement will also give 1. So even if you entangle these 2 qubits and take them apart, I take 1 to suppose Waterloo or MIT, and I measure 1 qubit here, I get a 0. It is certain that the person measuring it there will also get a 0 or a 1 depending on which is the entangled state. So that's really interesting. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance. There is no means of communication between the two, but once I measure my qubit, it is certain that the other guy is also going to measure that. So the use of that was for quantum teleportation. We come down back to communications, standard notation, Alice and Bob. Suppose Alice and Bob are 2 friends who met a long time ago. Before they separated, they generated an EPR pair or Bell state, and each one of them took 1 qubit of the EPR pair as they went different ways. After several years, Alice wants to send a qubit psi to Bob. However, she can send only classical information to Bob. So what happens? Now there are several problems before Alice. First of all, she does not know the state of the qubit psi. Suppose Alice starts by measuring psi. What is the problem? As soon as you measure a state, you end up destroying it. It is 0 plus 1 upon under root 2, for example, or alpha 0 plus beta 1. If I measure it, I end up with the classical answer 0 or 1. That state is now destroyed. It is no longer a superposition of the two. Now Alice wants to send a qubit to Bob. So the first problem is she does not know the state of the qubit psi. She doesn't know what she has to send. Second thing, even if she tries to determine the state psi, describing it precisely takes an infinite amount of information. Since the probabilities alpha and beta, they can take on any values to any number of decimals. So it has got infinite amount of information. And And even if she determines psi, it would take infinite time for Alice to describe the state to Bob, because you got infinite information. Second thing, she can communicate only over a classical communication channel. She wants to send a quantum bit, but she's got just a classical communication channel. So what happens? Now these two are Alice's qubits. The top two lines are Alice's qubits. Last one is Bob's qubit. Before they separated, they entangled these two states. Alice and Bob have got this beta 00 state entangled. Once they separated, Alice went her own way and took the first qubit. Bob went his own way, he took the second qubit. Now what happens is, this is the quantum teleportation circuit. Here, what happens is that you end up separating Alice and Bob, but still if they have got a classical communication channel, Alice can send a qubit to Bob. The way it works is psi 0 is psi into beta 00, which is the entangled state. So you can expand it like this. Alpha 0 plus beta 1 into the entangled state. Psi 1 is after the CMOS gate. So you end up with this state. Psi 2 is after this Hadamard gate. So you have got 4 terms here. This is very interesting because you have got 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0 and 1, 1, all the 4 states, but each one has got associated with a different qubit. Alpha 0 plus beta 1, alpha 1 plus beta 0, alpha 0 minus beta 1, alpha 1 minus beta 0. So for example, if now what is done, Alice measures her qubits. Now there are 4 possibilities. The 4 possibilities are Alice measures the 0, 0. In that case, she has got 0, 0. She measures 0, 0, so she has got alpha 0 plus beta. Bob ends up with alpha 0 plus beta 1. If Alice measures 0, 1, Bob ends up with alpha 1 plus beta 0. If Alice measures 1, 0, Bob ends up with this, and so on. So in these 4 possibilities, Bob can always come back to alpha 0 plus beta 1. The way this is done is, if Alice measures 0, 0, Bob has got psi. If Alice measures 0, 1, Bob has to use a poly X gate. He has got alpha beta, he wants to enter, he has got beta alpha, he ends up with alpha. If Alice measures 1, 0, he has to use a poly Z gate. And if Alice measures 1, 1, then Bob has to use a poly X gate and a poly Z gate. So he ends up again with alpha and beta. Some interesting facts about quantum teleportation. First, faster than light transfer of quantum information is not possible through teleportation, as the classical communication channel is involved in between, which prohibits speeds faster than light. The interesting part is, even though quantum information is being transmitted, we are using only a classical channel. So this is the classical channel between Alice and Bob. This is the only way they are communicating. So you can't have faster than light communication. Second, it might appear at first glance that a copy of the quantum state has been teleported. However, it is illusory, since after teleportation only Bob has his qubit in the state psi. So Alice has managed to send the qubit across to Bob, but Alice has no longer got that qubit with her. She has just one copy and that has been sent to Bob. So after teleportation, Alice destroys her qubits and she has got 2 classical bits, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, and the quantum bit she has sent across to Bob. This is a quantum entanglement setup based on lasers, which has been used to verify presence of entangled photons in the system. Next, we come down to quantum communication. I will go through it very briefly. We have a vision talk by Dr. Scott Aronson. We are glad he is there, and in that you will get to hear more of this stuff. But quantum communication, the advantage is any eavesdropping is detected by an error in the checkbits. The reason is, if Alice and Bob are communicating and Eve is the eavesdropper, and she catches hold of the qubit between them, and she measures the qubits. So the net result is Eve destroys the qubit, because as soon as you measure a qubit, it collapses. So she can no longer send it across to Bob. So immediately the eavesdropping is detected. Alice and Bob will always be able to discover that Eve has been listening to the line. This is a quantum communication setup realized at ETH Quantic Geneva, which has been used to verify this quantum communication ideas. Next, we come down to an even more interesting application, Shor's factoring algorithm. Factoring is at heart of cybersecurity or RSA crypto system. What is that? Now we have got e-commerce, e-business and all that, your credit cards. So what is the transaction security? The transaction security is the fact that it is very difficult to factor large numbers. I have got one part of the factor, the bank has got the other part. Only if the two of us communicate, I send my part of the factor, they multiply the two and check whether I have got the correct factor by. That is the reason why factoring is at the heart of cyber security. So Shor's algorithm reduces factoring problem to another simple problem, which is order finding. Factoring is difficult because suppose I ask you how much is 29083 x into y. You can't answer this question straightforward. You will have to do some paperwork. So for example, the number n is the number which you use to factorize, n is 21. What is done is a random number x is chosen between 1 and 20. Now suppose n is 21 and x is 2. What is done is number r is chosen such that, and for every state we compute XR model. So for example here r is 2. So it becomes 2 to the power 0 by 2 minus 1, 2 to the power 1 by 2 minus 1 and so on. So we complete this table 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 11 and we see that the sequence keeps repeating. Now the period of this sequence is the order. So in this case the order would be 6. So we can evaluate the factor as GCD of n and XR model. So the GCD of 7 and 21, which is 7, is indeed a factor. Now, use of quantum computers for order finding. The advantage of quantum computers is you don't have to do this process step by step. A quantum computer does this simultaneously for all the states. So if you have got a quantum Fourier transform to help you out, this is a 3-qubit quantum Fourier transform circuit, which can be used for this. So the factoring problem is equivalent to order finding problem. That's the interesting result I showed. And all the steps in the algorithm can be performed efficiently on a classical computer, except the order finding part. If you have to find the order, this process has to be done stepwise for every number, but a quantum computer does it simultaneously. Next we come down to Grover's search algorithm. Grover's algorithm is very interesting. Grover has given the result that you can search an unstructured database of size n in order root. Suppose you have got a directory with 10,000 names and you end up jumbling it. They are not in alphabetical order. So you have got 10,000 names jumbled up and I ask you to find one entry. The worst case is that it is the last entry, so in that case you will have to go through all the 10,000 entries to come to that. On an average you will have to go through at least 10 by 2 or 5,000 entries. So Grover has devised an algorithm that you can search the whole directory in order root n. So under root of 10,000 would be 100. So by just looking at in 100 steps you can come to the answer. So that's really interesting and baffling also. And what is even more interesting about Grover's algorithm is he has proved it is optimal. You can't beat it. You can't come down to less than 100 steps. So that is an even more interesting result. So for that, he has used an oracle. Oracle is a black box which does not know the solution to a problem, but can recognize it when it comes. So it's like a black box which does not know the solution, but it can recognize when the answer comes. So this is the schematic circuit for Grover search. Each stage is a Grover iteration. You have got order, root, and such iterations at the end of it. I prefer to explain Grover's algorithm using the graphical technique. So suppose you have got a search space of size n and there are m solutions to the problem. So there are n minus m non-solutions to the problem. Now let alpha be the set of all states which are not a solution to the problem and beta be set of all states which are a solution to the problem. So alpha and beta are mutually perpendicular. You can see here the two axes alpha and beta are perpendicular to each other. Now what happens is, one is the initial state psi. It is a mixture superposition of both alpha and beta states. Now the idea is first to apply the Grover's oracle. What Grover's oracle does is it performs a reflection of psi about alpha. So the first reflection is about the alpha axis and you end up at stage 2 after the oracle system. And the second thing is this is reflected about the initial state. So two reflections are equivalent to a rotation. So from the first state you end up at 2 and 2 is reflected back to 3. So the idea is from 1 you have ended up at 3. So slowly and slowly you are coming closer to the answer which is beta. So in order, in root and such steps you will be very close to beta. So each Grover iteration is a rotation by an angle theta. This is theta. Where cos theta by 2 is given by under root n minus So slowly and slowly you are brought closer and closer to the answer. Physical realization. The basic requirements for quantum computation are you must have a robust representation of quantum information. You should be able to perform a universal family of unitary transforms. You must be able to prepare a robust or fiduciary initial state. And you should be able to measure the output result. Some possibilities, optical photon quantum computer. It is quite possible that optical qubits will be used. But just as at present, optics is mostly used for communication rather than computation. Of course, you will hear talks later in the day by Dr. Goswami, Dr. Sukhdev on this. So I won't speak much on that, but it is quite possible that optical qubits will find a natural use in the communication of quantum information, such as quantum cryptography, rather than in quantum computation. So the natural home of optics is in communication. Optical cavity, quantum electrodynamics. This is a fabric narrow cavity with two clear parallel mirrors. The incident photons are absorbed in non-linear probability when traversing the cavity, and thus the true quantum transformation performed is not unitary. Then ion traps. I am just rushing through the physical realization techniques. Each one of them is a huge topic in its own. In ion traps, electron and nucleus will provide potentially good representation for qubits. A spin in one direction would be 0, spin in another direction would be 1. So the drawback is the experiments performed have used only a single spin and only 2 qubits, which is not really useful. You don't want a 2-qubit quantum computer. You have got processors now 32-bit, 64-bit. You don't want to come back to 2 qubits. But of course, you have got a promise. These technical limitations will someday be overcome and lifetimes can be extended by technological surprise. Maybe these trap bands will be less than of qubits in a quantum computer someday. NMR, direct manipulation and detection of nuclear spin states using radio frequency electromagnetic waves. This is an NMR quantum computer at Institute for Quantum Computing, University of Waterloo. University of Waterloo and MIT are working together to realize quantum computers, and it is quite likely they will be really successful. Using NMR, researchers created a 7-qubit quantum computer with a single drop of liquid. A company in D-Wave in Canada has made a 15 or 16-qubit quantum computer, they claim, but it remains to be verified. This latest advance would lead to computers that use quantum bits or qubits for information processing. Silicon quantum computer. The advantage of silicon is we are so familiar with it. All our computers are based on silicon. So the approach to building a solid state quantum computer is by exploiting quantum states of artificial atoms and molecules built in semiconductor quantum dot systems. The advantage of using silicon is we are familiar with it from years of building classical computers. So someday on your processor, instead of Intel inside, you can have spins inside quantum processor. But sitting here, you don't have to wait to realize a quantum computer to start working on quantum computing. You have got software simulators with which you can test out your ideas. Even on a desktop PC, you don't need a NMR machine or laser-based setup to start working on quantum computing. An example is quantum computing simulator. You have got very easy controls, Windows-based, and you can realize big quantum circuits. For example, this is a Hadamard gate, 2 Hadamard gates. You can verify it's working. You end up with the correct answer. And options like getting the answer in vector form or transfer matrix. Then another software is QCAD, CAD for quantum computer simulator, which is a graphical design environment for quantum circuits. You can have a quantum simulator for several gates, and you can export the EPS and bitmap file of circuits designed by QCAD. I think some of the students must have got this book in their kit. All these are included in the CD-ROM. So this is a blank circuit in QCAD. There is no limitation. You can go even to higher numbers of qubits. You can calculate the answers, get the answer in qubit form. QUAC is quantum computer simulator for MATLAB. All commands operate from within the MATLAB environment. So the advantage is they are all familiar with MATLAB. You have got small codes there, edge gate, Z gate, NOT gate, and so on. The features supported by it include single qubit and Bell state preparation, single qubit unitary gates, control NOT gates, Fourier transforms, single qubit Bell measurements, classically controlled operations, and so on. The same teleportation example which we discussed earlier has been verified using QUAC. So, for example, this is the QUAC code for teleportation. You can see here it checks the outcomes. If outcome is 0, 0, display applied I correction. If outcome is 0, 1, you need a poly X gate. If outcome is 1, 0, you need to apply a Z gate. If the outcome is 1, 1, you have to apply X and Z to the conditions. The MATLAB output can be seen. So for example, the measurement result is 0, 1. So you end up applying an X gate and you get the final answer. Then some interesting future applications. One interesting application is 3D unicast using teleportation. Right now we have got video conferencing and all that, but quantum teleportation is totally different. In quantum teleportation, every information about the physical particle is transmitted. For example, we are safely escorted to this hall here. If we got quantum teleportation somewhere, suppose in the United States, MIT or Waterloo, this room is recreated as it is. Every information about every particle is transmitted there. So the people sitting there almost, they are literally feel that they are sitting in this hall. So that is the advantage of 3D unicast using teleportation. But it is still believed to be almost 50 years ago. One way of that could be you have got two cameras to give you a 3D stereoscopic view. You use a quantum encoder to get your output alpha 0 plus beta 1, teleport it. At the other end you got a quantum decoder and a 3D projection system. So you get a 3D image at the receiver end. These are some very rudimentary ideas. The entangled states, but the interesting part is entangled states have to be created beforehand. The transmitter and receiver have to have thousands of entangled states created beforehand. So someday it could be as simple as carrying around entangled states on a pen drive or USB token somewhere. I insert my pen drive in the laptop, it creates the entangled states with the laptop, I take the pen drive there, I have got entangled states. Maybe that's one idea. The problem with multicasting is, multicasting means sending it to several destinations together. You've got the no cloning theorem of quantum computing. You can't recreate a quantum, you can't copy a qubit. So if I have to send this information to maybe 50 places, I can't copy it 50 times. So again, some ideas could be you use entangled states. You got a quantum encoder camera 1, 2 and so many states. You teleport each one qubit to every place. But again, each receiver has to have its own bank of entangled bits shared with the transmitter, which might someday become as simple as a SIM card of your telephone. So now we come to part 2, which is nanocomputing. We start with Feynman's remark, there is plenty of room at the bottom. This is the remark delivered by the Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman in his address at Caltech in 1969, where he first coined ideas on nanotechnology and nanocomputing. I'll continue with Feynman's remarks. They are really interesting. If we wanted to make a computer that had all these marvelous extra qualitative capabilities, we would have to make it perhaps the size of the pentagon. This has several disadvantages. First, it requires too much material. There will not be enough germanium in the world for all the transistors, which would have to be put into this enormous thing. Second, there is also the problem of heat generation and power consumption. PVA would be needed to run the computer. Number 3, an even more practical difficulty is that the computer would be limited to a certain speed. Because of its large size, there is finite time required to get the information from one place to another. So it cannot go faster than speed of light. So ultimately, when our computers get faster and faster and more elaborate, we will have to make them smaller and smaller. So he visualized this long time. This is Shockley's first transistor at Bell Labs in 1947. Next came integrated circuits. The integrated circuit was invented independently in 1959 by Jack Kilby and Robert Morris. What they said that time was, what we didn't realize then was that the integrated circuit would reduce the cost of electronic functions by a factor of 1,000,000 to 1. Nothing had ever been done for anything before on that scale. If automobile speed had increased similarly over the same period, you could now drive from San Francisco to New York in about 13 seconds. So that is the kind of advantage offered by nanocomputing. Definition of nanocomputing: use of distinct properties of structures on the scale of 100 nanometers per second to solve complex mathematical or logical problems or to accomplish any of the tasks that we expect of our computers. There is another interesting definition of nanometer. They say it is the amount by which your nail grows in a second. So you can really imagine how small is a nanometer. Nanometer would be 10 to the power minus 9 meter. So it is the amount by which a nail grows in a second roughly. So that's really small. Why nanocomputing? One might wonder why we even need to improve if we already have adequate funds. I got a computer, it's working fine. Why do I get into this nano business? Why even bother going through the trouble of trying to make computers smaller if there will be problems in doing so? The answer lies here. The reason technologists and scientists even bother with nanocomputing is because of the potential it holds for the future. As an example, the same amount of information that fits on a current 80 gigabyte hard drive will be able to fit in a space that is too small to see with the naked eye. This will revolutionize the computer industry and take devices such as cell phones and Palm Pilots to new level. Just one example. Number of operations per second could increase by a factor of at least 10 to the power 6. Complex math problems and complex molecular chemistry problems, DNA chemistry, proteins that have not been solved yet will be able to be solved. So you have to make the transition from microtechnology to nanotechnology. As an example, you have got two structures here. The structure on the right is a single electron transistor. This is the source and this is the drain. Normally an electron can't go from the source to the drain. So according to classical physics, there is no way that electrons can get from the source to the drain because of the two barrier bonds on either side of the screen. However, the structure is so small that quantum effects occur and electrons can under certain circumstances tunnel through the barriers. But this happens only one electron at a time. Thus a single electron will work only if you use quantum mechanics. So you have to achieve this transition from microtechnology to nanotechnology. Another interesting idea is to use cells like this. So for example, this adder circuit could be in this form maybe in the future. Single electron transistor to the ultimate computer element would be a molecule. Although both the above structures use quantum mechanics, only the one on the right could be employed in a true quantum computer. Because the 1s and 3s nuclei are isotopically labeled chloroform, behave like small magnets and interact with an external magnetic field. So some ideas for computing in the future using nanotechnology. Carbon nanotubes are a very interesting proposition. Carbon nanotubes are formed when a sheet of carbon atoms is rolled up to form molecular atoms or cylinders. These cylinders have a diameter of only about 1 to 20 nanometers, but can have lengths from 100 nanometers to several microns. The fabrication of the tubes is what determines whether they are semiconductor material or metallic material. So you can see here graphite forms and strips rolled into carbon nanotubes. Carbon nanotubes have got interesting properties, very interesting. Strongest and most flexible molecular material because strong carbon-carbon covalent bonding. Young's modulus is very high. Maximum strain order almost 10%. Electrical conductivity 6 orders of magnitude higher than copper. That's really good. Can be metallic or semiconducting depending on chirality with tunable band. For chirality, the ability of not matching with its mirror image. That is chirality. Very high current carrying capacity, can be functionalized and so on. You can see some ways in which carbon nanotubes are grown. This is the computer simulated picture of a nanotube transistor. Source, gate and drain for the carbon nanotube here. Another interesting material is silicon nanowires. Since silicon is the popular material inside of computers already, so this observation makes replacing bulk silicon channels with silicon nanowires an appealing option. The advantage of silicon is we are so familiar with it. So anything to do with silicon, we have got the fabrication facilities, you don't have to make new investment. So that's the advantage of using silicon. This shows some emerging computer technologies. On this scale, you have got the size, log scale of meters. This is the switching time and this is the cost. At present, quantum computing is here. The cost is high, but the switching time is low. And it doesn't will really much here also. If you look at other ways like biologically inspired computing, I think Dr. Sukhdev will talk about it later in the day, or optical computing as Dr. Goswami. So you can see where each technology is currently placed. So with respect to the current silicon CMOS technology, the various other new computing paradigms can be analyzed here based on each criteria, the cost, switching time and size. Molecular computing is here. The cost is low, but the switching time is more than quantum computing. And the size is almost on the same axis. Some more potential applications of nanotechnology. Expansion of mass storage electronics to huge multi-terabit memory capacity, increasing by 1,000-fold the memory storage per unit. IBM has announced a technique for transforming iron and platinum into magnetic equivalent of gold, which would be a nanoparticle that can hold a magnetic charge for as long as 10 years. This breakthrough would radically transform the computer disk drive industry, making materials and products from the bottom up. That is, by building them from individual atoms and molecules. Bottom-up manufacturing should require fewer materials and pollute less. Developing materials that are 10 times stronger than steel, but a fraction of the weight. Improving computing speed and efficiency of transistors and memory chips by factor of millions. Using gene and drug delivery to detect disease cells. removing finest contaminants from water and air to promote a cleaner environment and potable water. Some applications of nanotech. Next we come down to nanocomputing with imperfections. When you go smaller and smaller, it is more difficult to fabricate things and you end up with imperfections. So you can have permanent faults, intermittent faults or transient faults. So permanent faults are because of physical defect, intermittent faults, stop and start faults, transient faults due to temporary environment conditions. So you can do nanocomputing in the presence of defects and faults. To maximize the reliability of the system based on nanoscale devices for a given or minimal cost, we expect that it may require a combination of techniques at various levels of abstraction from the device to the application level. As an example, extremely high degree of hardware reliability may not be necessary if the application itself can handle a certain degree of noise in its data. In such a case, it may not be cost effective to use extreme levels of redundancy when the application does not require it. So some ways of redundancy are modular redundancy. Triple modular redundancy, you've got 3 modules for the same thing. You take the majority of both. So in case one device goes down, you still have got the majority vote in your favor. Then N modular redundancy, which works till floor N by 2 module failure. So the advantage of NMR over TMR is NMR will correctly compute the output of multiple defects or faults in floor N by 2 of the modules. Then reconfiguration. Each cell can receive configuration commands from adjacent cells and in turn can send reconfiguration commands to neighboring cells. If something goes wrong in one part of your, suppose, cell in the body, what happens is that joining cells take over its function or they try to heal the wound or whatever. So we are trying the same idea. This allows a cell or collection of cells to monitor the neighbor's activities, detect erroneous behavior, disable defective neighboring cells and relocate damaged segments of the circuit to other locations. Then fault simulation test beds are there. Next interesting idea is defect tolerance, which is you have got very large reconfigurable fabrics and the fabric has got the capability to reconfigure itself and repair faults. So for example, a nano block is the smallest configurable logic block of a nano fabric, and a nano fabric would consist of many regularly tied nano blocks interspersed with routing resources. In such cases, you need to do identification of defective components. You've got a huge sheet like this of nano fabric, very largely configurable fabric. Of course, you have faults in that. So, identification of defective components needs to be done to isolate these faults. So, for that, if you've got a small defect rate, suppose here, you do the testing vertically and horizontally, so you end up detecting the fault. But in case of high defect rates, it won't really work out because you get a lot of errors in that case. So you can test a nano fabric in a wave-like manner like this. Then cell matrix. A cell matrix is used for overcoming manufacturing defects. You discard any hardware that is not perfect, repair or remove and replace individual defects, build redundancy into the hardware and the means to use only perfect resources within the hardware, use logic designs that can function despite defects or runtime faults, or you perfect the manufacturing technique so that it creates no defects. That's the ultimate goal. Then guard wall is another interesting idea. If something goes wrong, you build a guard wall around it. So the construction of a guard wall can be seen for a 2 cell-like defects. These 2 black ones are the defective. So a guard wall is built around it by the other cells. Next you come down to another interesting idea, which is quantum dots. Quantum dots are nanostructures created from standard semiconductor materials such as indium arsenide and gallium arsenide. These structures can be modeled as 3-dimensional quantum wells. As a result, they exhibit energy quantization effects even at distances several hundred times larger than the material system that is constant. So quantum dots have been used to build quantum dot cylinder automata. So a polarization like this would be interpreted as a binary 1 and a polarization like this would be interpreted as a binary 0. So you can build a QCA majority gate or majority voter using this. If you have got 3 inputs A, B, C, the majority vote goes through because the polarization sustains it. QCA cells lined up in this way create a QCA wire. If you give the input here, the polarization sustains and you end up transmitting the state to the output. You can make a QCA NOT or inverter gate. For that you have to make a circuit like this. The immersion takes place here. One is being transmitted and here the polarization changes to its input. Then another interesting thing you need, another important thing rather you need in electronic circuits is fan out, multiple copies. So QCAs have that property. You give the input and the polarization can be detected simultaneously at several outputs. Then you have got a QC inversion chain. This is a 1 0 1 0. At every stage, the output gets. You apply a NOT gate at every stage. So 1 becomes a 0 0 1 and so on. The interesting thing about QC inversion chain is, suppose I have got a plane link like this and an inversion chain. The two can cross each other without any interference. So the 0 is transmitted straight as it is, and this inversion chain also works simultaneously. You got QCA designer software. This example shows a simple 4-bit processor layout. So there are software tools also for that. Molecular computing is just one slide I have included. You'll hear a lot of this in the other talks later in the day. You've got molecular electronic switches, bacterial or oxygen-based computers. I think Dr. Sukdev will talk about them. In these circuits, the notion is of harnessing individual molecules at nanoscales for computational purposes. And in fact, molecular computing started with Edelman's experiment of Hamiltonian path problems and so on. You'll hear more of this in the day. Then some more ideas. Optical computing. You've got Dr. Goswami's talk later in the day on the power of coherence. If you want more ideas of this, you can see this book. I believe the students must have got it in the kit. I give a copy handy in case I forget something. We have got research collaboration with IIT Kanpur. Of course, Dr. Goswami is there, Dr. Kala is there, University of Waterloo, Canada, MIT, USA, Dr. Aronson is there from MIT, Department of Science and Technology, Government of India. Then nanocomputing again, we have got research collaborations again with IIT Kanpur and Delhi, University of Waterloo, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Funding agencies, Department of Science and Technology, the US Forum, Bell Labs. The speaker is extremely grateful to Professor Premcharan Satsangi, Chairman Advisory Committee on Education, Jharkhand, for introduction to the fields of quantum and nanocomputing. And I'll conclude again with a quotation by Niels Bohr. I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics.